And this is, I don't know how many of you were here yesterday morning, right? I was talking about my thinking about the future, talking about China and the internet not as one thing, but as in different places, different corporations, and also different histories. And this panel is exactly about the local situations, the more nuanced case studies within China and within internet, and also Japan, one of the presenters going to also go beyond China. So this is indeed a panel that I very much look forward to. So without further ado, we will start with Tom McDonald. The last time I talked to him was 2 to 3 years ago when he was doing fantastic work. Yes, so please.
Okay, thank you so much. It's really, really nice to be here today, and hopefully something completely different to everything you've heard so far today, from the meso and the macro right down to the micro, and this is probably as small as it gets. So this paper really is about the impact of the growing availability of home internet connections in Red Mountain Town, which is this county-level town in southwest China. And specifically then, this town has in the past few years seen a really big increase in both the availability of and the adoption of home broadband connections, just ADSL. And it offers direct, and primarily this has offered direct competition to longer established internet cafes and other modes of access in the town. And really what I want to show with this article is that many parents hoped that home internet broadband connections would resolve what they perceive to be the inherent danger of internet cafes by attracting their offspring back home. So it will show the presence of these offspring in the home was viewed as being kind of necessary for these bonds of kinship to be created, and the absence of people's children from their own home was greeted with worry and concern. The article uses ethnographic evidence which I collected over 18 months living there, and I was living just right at the top, just here in one of the villages where it turns into the countryside. And significantly, what I'm going to be talking about today, it takes a material culture approach. So looking at the relationships people have with their objects, in addition to their verbal accounts of how they use things. And it privileges the humility of objects, the fact that objects which we use every day in our everyday lives often become so innocuous to us that we don't even notice that we're using them, whereas they're actually very significant. So what this paper emphasizes is that the installation of these connections, these ADSL connections, was actually simply just the first stage in the process of domestication. And such technologies always required further appropriation in order to be integrated into family life. And this paper uses this ethnographic examples to show how different families in Red Mountain Town were able to domesticate internet connections to quite different ends. And most importantly, in addition, this essay will use this theory of domestication to provide an ulterior, but not at all contradictory account to the one given by Sylvia on the reason why people move away from internet cafes. Because you cite the process, if I've understood it correctly, as being one involving an act of kind of a creation of identity by which individual users attach varying levels of distinction to different sites of internet access and different gaming practices. Whereas instead this research, in a completely different context, emphasizes that internet users aren't just completely autonomous decision makers, but that the provision and economy of internet connections has a large effect on their choice of access, and is also but also emphasizes the way in which parents and family members seek to influence the practices and behaviors of their offspring. And in so doing, looks at the continuation of families that are built through shared practice. So just a really, really quick background on domesticating ICTs and the implications for China. So the main theory of domestication comes from Roger Silverstone and is largely responsible for this very influential theory in which he attempts to describe the process that ICTs need to go through when they become introduced into the home. And Haddon notes that one of the important legacies of this approach is that rather than trying to describe specific motives or functions of an ICT, instead we can emphasize the social relationships that surround these technologies, and especially important, foregrounding the consideration of the interactions that exist between household members and how norms, regulations, tensions, or even conflicts over uses of technology emerge when they come into the home. So just to run over, Silverstone developed these kind of 4 important concepts about domestication of ICTs. And he said that, there's appropriation, which is the management of ICTs when they come into the home, objectification, which is the physical and symbolic location of how they are in the home, incorporation, which illustrates this connection with the routines and structures of daily life, and conversion on how technologies are displayed. And hopefully what I can show with my ethnography, which will follow in a second, is that the first 3 are overwhelmingly really important in this case. And yeah, I think what's really good is through this kind of approach, what my ethnography shows, I believe, is that really it kind of mirrors what Sylvia said about these unique spaces of multiple internets. That the internet, initially, I think I found with my work, parents viewed it as this thing. But once it came into the house, they were forced to make sense of it and realised that there are lots of different functions and lots of different parts of it. So this idea of kind of a familiarity that you gain through kind of contact with this thing is one of the overwhelming themes that hopefully my work will show in just a second. So to make sense of the kind of adoption of home internet connections, I just really, really quickly need to just profile internet cafes in the town to just make you aware of them. So during the period of my fieldwork from 2009 to 2011, still overwhelmingly for most youth in the town, the most popular way of connecting to the internet remained through these internet cafes. By the year of 2012, the number of cafes in the town had grown to no less than 13, and these cafes were located on the main streets in the town, and these cafes were open 24 hours a day, and in common with lots of practices elsewhere in China, the terminals were rented to customers according to the amount of time they used. In these cafes, around 90% of customers, just by doing a quick head count, were actually males, and they were typically all below 25 years of age. And in common with Jack's own work and reflections of internet cafes in China, I noticed that these cafes, customers overwhelmingly use the space as collective spaces for gaming and to meet, and they were much more entertainment centres where they predominantly played games with their friends. Now, of course, there is, in this town, there was youths use these cafes for long periods of time, and typically there existed a discourse which matches this large discourse that's already been written about in academia and been profiled quite a lot about concerns and worries regarding the safety of internet cafes. These include a large public discourse that worries about things like the moral impact of internet cafes and the damaging effects it has on people's kind of educational performance and morality. I also saw worries about the effects that it had on health that people spoke to me about, tales of school expulsion, and the idea that they were chaotic places where there were too many people. So there is nothing relatively new there, so I'm just going to skip over that, but I think it's important to make a mention of it. And now I'm going to go and talk about the ethnography. The issue of what happens when an internet connection comes into a house. And to do this, I want to give one example. So, in recent years then, home internet connections, have become increasingly common in the town. The service was first provided in this town by China Telecom, And then from 2010, China Unicom also got on into the scene. And as noted by Jack as well, in contrast to the severe government regulations and controls that are common with internet cafes, the government and the telecoms companies strongly promoted the expansion of home broadband concerns across the country. In my town, I also saw this, and it was most prominently seen through advertisements, wall advertisements placed all over the town that really prominently advertised the availability of these connections. Home broadband coverage was first offered to all the work unit houses in the town, and if I go here, you can see, so all the work unit houses were the red areas in the town, and almost all of that area had connectivity. During my period of fieldwork, and the blue areas are new commercial houses, so these all had ADSL plugged in. During the period of my fieldwork, all these green areas are the village and the city areas, and I lived in this one right here. And as the fieldwork was happening, these places started to get connections as well and started to be able to subscribe and get installations. So although statistical reports in China, show that 88.8% of all users nationwide connect at the home, I think, whereas 27.9% of users will connect in internet cafes, here I suspect the difference is not so pronounced, and I've already said that I think more young people were connecting in cafes than in the home. And part of this is because it's quite a low-income region in China, in Yunnan in the west. And also another part is the physical limited availability of these connections at that time. So installing broadband actually in the home was viewed by many parents as offering this potential to address some of these problems that were seen to be created by internet cafes by physically bringing young people back into the home. However, the ethnographic example of the Li family here will demonstrate installation of the internet into the homes brought with it a whole new set of issues and problems which disturb the daily life and the routines of the family. So, in Mr. Li's village in the city home, the issue of the internet mainly revolved around a battle for the presence of their youngest son. Mr. Li was a former farmer who now worked as a wholesaler of soft drinks for the district. And he lived with his wife, his elderly mother, and their two sons, aged 14 and 21 respectively, in their house, which was in one of those village in the city areas. One of the most remarkable features about the internet in their home was how the positioning of the computer terminal within the house and the provision of broadband service to the home actually changed over the period of fieldwork. So this is over these 18 months. When I first arrived at Mr. Li's house, the computer was located in the two brothers' shared bedroom, so just down here. It was a tower computer, and it was placed on an old kind of decrepit office desk that was made out of laminated chipboard, and it had a bed on either side for both of the sons, yeah? Now, Mr. Li explained to me that the reason that they had installed the internet in the home was they were really concerned about their youngest son and the amount of time he was spending away from the home playing on computers, both at the neighbour's house and in internet cafes. So installing the computer initially achieved exactly what the Lees wanted. Once the computer was in place, the son stopped going outside and he was there every day playing on the internet. And he contentedly occupied himself with hours and hours of gaming. And in particular, he concentrated his efforts on Crossfire, and played mostly with his classmates who were in other houses in the town or in the internet cafes, using this online multiplayer mode. However, though, this avid kind of gaming created a whole new set of concerns for the parents, as the extent of his appetite for this gaming and what he was actually doing became immediately visible to his parents. So although his parents had achieved this ambition, they were now troubled by having to directly see what he was doing and the amount of time that their son spent playing these games. Furthermore, the sighting of the computer in this room led to a significant restructuring of just the day-to-day life of the family. For example, one of the staple rhythms of the Lees family daily practice was summed up by Mrs. Lee's expression, "Eat dinner, watch TV." 就是吃饭看电视. So, which she often described every day. She said it with a degree of joy after every meal. And they used to take their meals up here in the kitchen in this table. And then immediately after, they'd all kind of decamp to this room here, the guest hall, which is more like a living room, and watch the TV for an hour or two, where they would kind of talk about the soap operas, talk about who was the good people and who were the bad people on the soap operas, and talk about the personalities of the characters. However, when the internet was introduced to the home, this kind of routine changed. And what happened is before dinner started, she would have to call her son, and her son was always became the last person to go to dinner. So she would have to call repeatedly before he came to the kitchen to eat. Then her youngest son would eat a few mouthfuls and then go back to play on the computer again. So this kind of practice of watching the TV changed completely. So it became problematic because actually it initially failed to achieve what the parents really seemed to want. Although it brought the family together in the bounds of the house, it did not bring them together into joint activities, into actually doing things together. So instead, Mr. Lee and his wife spent the time in the guest hall, watching soap operas as before, and both of their sons, in fact, spent lots of time in the bedroom playing on the computer. In this case, although the internet had been brought into the domestic sphere, it hadn't really been truly domesticated, if you like, in the sense that Silverstone refers to domestication as the process through which information communication technologies become inconspicuous, or if not invisible, within the home. In fact, if anything, I'd argue that what happened is when the internet came into the home, it became doubly conspicuous, that actually people were seeing how these were really being used. So the installation of the computer and the home internet connections had further effects on the family's daily routine, apart from this one. Having unlimited access to the internet as opposed to this hourly billing meant that their kind of use increased dramatically. The boys started playing games quite late into the night as well, and Mr. Lee's wife was particularly worried that the presence of the computer in the room meant that her youngest son was failing to take naps after lunch, or even going to sleep at the appropriate time at night. His parents often complained that his inability to prepare for the middle school exams was affected by this game playing. At dinner times, his mother sometimes asked him what time did he go to sleep the night before, and would often cite the gaming as the cause of his poor exam results. Now, Mr. Lee's wife even asked me for advice on how to curb her son's internet use. The complaints of his parents seemed to have little effect, though, and the situation came to a head when their parents exercised the most effective and direct possible method in which to control their son's access to the internet. They just stopped paying the monthly fee. And in China, when you stop paying the fee, they just stop the connection. The service got suspended. However, this action only kind of half achieved what they wanted this time, because while they had the connection, the sons had downloaded loads of games off the internet that they could play without a connection. So they kept playing lots of games just without the online ones. And the story then developed a further kind of bit when the monitor itself, which was an old cathode ray tube monitor, developed a fault and stopped working completely, so they couldn't use the computer. What happened as a result of that is kind of the household routines began going back to the stage it was in before they had the computer and the internet. However, as a response to this, the son's kind of presence in the home also kind of waned, and he went back to using the internet and connections outside the home, and often didn't return for meals, and so on. So eventually, kind of, the parents relented, and they choose to reconnect the computer to the internet, and they purchased a whole new LCD monitor for the computer. Now, once this had happened, on the day that it was reinstalled, I was there, and I witnessed Mr. Lee clearly warning his son that if he was to once again fail to complete his homework or to play too late into the night, then he would literally take a pair of scissors and cut the line, he told his son. However, following the reintroduction of the internet into the house, another interesting development occurred. Both of the parents very gradually became aware of ways in which they could use the internet for their own amusement. So for the father, it was the introduction of the online version of the playing card game Tease the Landlord. I'll put a picture of Mahjong up because the same thing applies to this. Yeah, absolutely. Now, Tease the Landlord is by far the most popular card game in Red Mountain Town and is mostly engaged by men as a pastime involving gambling small amounts of money. In the online version of the game, again, this is online Mahjong, not Tease the Landlord, players play against two online opponents and winning a round just wins them a fixed amount of points, no gambling. Now, Mr. Lee explained to me that the reason he liked online Mahjong instead of, online Tease the Landlord instead of the card game is that you didn't have to find people. Normally he'd spend half an hour trying to find people to play games and you could just go on and they were straight there. One of the really, and another thing that was great about this is actually what happened was his sons would gather around while he was playing and they'd give him advice and tips on which cards that he should put out. So this kind of accords with Hans Steinmüller, an anthropologist, who says that actually gaming practices in China attract bystanders. So it became a communal activity. And for his wife, she realised the potential of the internet in allowing her to watch a vast collection of TV programs. One night she observed her sons who were watching television things on PPS, which is there, and she asked them to teach him. She asked his sons to teach her how to use PPS, and shortly after that she went into hospital to have surgery, and she was kind of bedbound for 2 weeks, and she put herself in her bed in her son's room and spent the whole 2 weeks watching PPS. And her son started to join her and everything. So all of this came to a head when actually they started to redecorate this entrance hall. What happened was the entrance hall was kind of like the guest hall. They painted it pink. They put a nice sofa in here. Previously it was bare. And then they relocated the PC into here. And they ended up all watching the TV together, or playing Mahjong together. Sometimes they even had a real Mahjong table here and the PC playing Mahjong at the same time. So, the problem with ethnography is we have all this great detail and now we have to make sense of it and add it to something theoretical. So that's what I'm going to do in the last 3 minutes. Not all, this is just one example of one house, and I must emphasize it in one place in China, and China is enormous. And it's just one example. However, what can we say about it? Well, I think one of the most important things is other people appropriated it in different ways in houses. In other houses in the town, I saw it kind of reinforcing bad connections that already existed between parents and children. Parents who didn't speak to their children for months. Once the internet came into the house, it was in their son's bedroom. The son closed their door and stayed in the house. It was an excuse not to talk to their parents. So, I mean, I think these examples, in anthropology, it's always difficult to draw conclusions from specific ethnographies. But I think one of the things that kind of my work talks about is that it's profiled like a gradual turning away from internet connections in the home, and most notably in internet cafes, in favour of an increasing trend of installing these connections in the home. Now, what happened before is these findings correspond with what Jack has written about kind of the observation that internet cafes used to be the preserve of a Chinese elite and are increasingly becoming associated with less reputable elements of society. And as such, these spaces are increasingly perceived as being troublesome. But also, this illustrated a turn away from internet cafes, emphasizing the importance of tracing these multiple internets and how different sites of internet use juxtapose, interact, and antagonize each other through everyday practices. And importantly, whereas Sylvia's approach kind of emphasizes the way in which online media creation and use in multiple spheres are not separate from cultural processes but are part of it, by showing how different online games and methods are continually evolving and are linked to different political, economic, and social transformations in China. And whereas kind of Sylvia concludes that like the digital games and access points become a way in which young people communicate ideas relating to class, identity, and social groups. Here, there is. I'd like to add that they here I'd like to add that actually the role of other relationships. So here, my aim isn't to refute what Sylvia said. In fact, I find it really, really persuasive. And I emphasize again that this is a really different social and economic background. But rather, I really want to emphasize the role of other relationships in constantly influencing these sites of internet access and shifting the focus to the home. By shifting the focus to the home, I've really been able to reveal parents who are installing home-based internet connections in an attempt to bring their offspring back into the family. I think one of the great things about this is it emphasizes how these kind of media fit in and coexist with other types of media and activities into existing relationships, and that always these things have an agency of themselves and an unpredictability. And I'm sure, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Lee never imagined that over the months that this thing was installed in their house, it would have such an effect and it would end up like that. So I think really, if my conclusion is anything, I think it's that. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Carl. We can have a quick, question for clarity. But before I open the floor, I just want to share one small ethnographic observation. Was that last time I was talking to Tom about his project, it was in my office. He was as passionate as he is, but he was not as confident as today.
Wow, thanks.
And he was saying, actually with Yunnan accents, we were talking to each other in Mandarin. He said, I said, I've only done 9 months of field work, so I don't feel so. But then come, my students, like if I send them to do field work in the factory zone for 3 months, they would think, can I come back in 2 months? This is indeed a very solid piece of ethnography, and I'm really glad to see how it has, matured. Okay, David.
I love your research, as you know. I love your data that you've collected and stuff like that. I was just struck just now by the similarity of your conclusions and stuff to the work done by, say, Sonia Livingston on youth of computing in Europe.
Okay.
Youth computing in Europe, this way around, and how young people use this and how this should be integrated in families. Also, in the States, I think it was Pew Research that did a big study on how young people can be integrated into the family, or how families can deal with internet. And they came to very similar conclusions that you had, sort of in terms of basically making the computer part of family life, or putting it somewhere where the whole family shares the experience on the screen and all this stuff. So it's a great stuff there. So.
And I think, one of the real things I feel is that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. Through my research, I'm screaming for a way to find out, what's Chinese about this? And we were talking about this today, is that I think one of the things that might be worth realizing is that sometimes there are things that people have in common, and that we don't necessarily have to always talk about the Chinese internet as if it's some kind of bizarre other. And I hope, one of the big things is that I'm really committed to ethnographic engagement and to living with people who are really different for a long time, because I think through that process you realise that they're not that different after all. And I think that was one of the things that kind of came out of my work, is that these people have the same worries and concerns as most of us, and they worry about their children and their family. And I hope that if this could kind of profile that and put it out there, then that might not be a bad finding at all.
But I think that's a similar, let me clarify, because David, you early argued today, right, saying that we shouldn't imagine Chinese internet as something completely different. Okay, so what you're confirming from very different points of departure. Okay, That's a very good thing we're observing. Any quick question? Or, by the way, I want to add one thing. I'm not whether everyone knows what is a county level city. Okay, this is the Chinese. Okay, way.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's called a xiancheng, and it basically is the level underneath a city is a county. So this county had a population of about 200,000 over, I can't remember how many square kilometers, but the town itself has a population of just under 100,000 people.
But then the county level, this is different from the US. I don't know about the UK.
Yeah.
It's actually county means the rural area. So
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Our next presenter is from is local, okay, and he's going to be telling us about social entrepreneurship online, and from China and Japan, and the paper is done by Tuka Toivonen and
Shibai, that's me, yes.
Shibai, and also Jun Han, but Shibai is going to be presented.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I'm very glad to present this paper today. It's going to be quite different from the previous one, which is very rich in empirical data. Our paper will be somehow more theoretical and speculative, because this is the kind of preliminary paper that is coming out from our collaborative research project. So I'm from the politics department, and the other two authors are from sociology and management. And so basically the objective of this paper is to, first of all, situate our research within the social entrepreneurship literature. And then I will try to introduce the key concepts of social innovation community and collaborative logic. And then I will consider the potential of internet architectures to facilitate social innovation. And finally, I will, if we have time, I will present a tentative case from China. So the project really originates from our shared interest in social entrepreneurship from different angles, which can be defined as a market-oriented, innovative activity with the potential of addressing a wide range of complex public problems. There is a significant rise of social entrepreneurship since the 1980s and 90s. And scholars have attributed to this rise to various reasons. Some identify key organizational agents in advancing and shaping this paradigm on a global level. Others have noted the role of certain government strategies and policies, for example, the New Labour's Third Way, and more recently, the Conservative government's Big Society campaign, that sought to give civil society a greater role in the provision and improvement of public services. We also know that there is a time gap between the rise of social entrepreneurship in the West and the rise in Japan and China, which happened mostly in the last decade. So I want to point it out that we realize that there is certain deficiencies in the research so far. Number one is that mostly the research so far has been focused on accounts of individual actors and individual enterprises and particular strategies in isolation from others in the field. And secondly, most of the analysis are about this global and national diffusion of alternative social entrepreneurial paradigms. And researchers have not really explained the development of social entrepreneurial activities at the meso and micro level. for example, in cities and in local communities. And most regrettably, most of the tensions have been on commercial firms and, for example, hacker networks. And there's not much tension on collaborative internet-mediated social innovations. So it is against this backdrop that we propose a very contrasting approach, which directly concern with collaborative social innovation communities and their internet architectures. So first of all, we need to define what we mean by social innovation community. And by that, we refer to a sustained interaction between entrepreneurial actors and their supporters who have been brought together through a shared interest in advancing social innovation. And we're not really concerned with particular innovation outputs, but we are very much focused on their activities, which are knowledge-driven and idea-generating. And what we have observed so far is that the social innovation community of various shapes and sizes and functions, they are increasingly serve as a driving force behind social entrepreneurial changes. And secondly, the creativity and impact of these communities are very likely to be shaped by how they're configured. For example, how open and closed their communities are, how heterogeneous their memberships are, like age, professional background, mission focus, gender, ethnicity, and of course, internet, the use of internet, for example, using tools such as emails and co-creation and group work platforms is very much part of this configuration. And thirdly, this social innovation community is very much brought an emphasis to the individual, the role of individual in innovating and collaborating with others. And fourth point is that it is particularly relevant to China because the restrictions on associational life, and therefore people have to rely on online space to interact with each other. So so the three of us basically have been looking at different cases, and we realized that to have a very fruitful comparison, we need a kind of unified framework and a conceptual clarity. So the questions we want to address here is, first of all, why do social innovation communities carry out the activities in the first place? And secondly, what keeps members engaged and motivated? And thirdly, why do they collaborate without direct monetary compensation? So we propose that the best approach is to, first of all, sketch out a fundamental organizational pattern. And we adopted this approach of institutional logic. Basically, it's the practices, material practice and symbolic constructions which will organize their social and economic activities. And the literature so far have pointed out two types of organizational, institutional logics. The first one is bureaucratic work community, and second one is basically a corporation, economically based. And we want to add a third one, that is the collaborative logic. So here is a comparison between these institutional logics. The first, the logic of bureaucratic community, basically it's like a work unit or a government agency in both in China and in the West. So it values loyalty, conformity, dependence, and the members are driven by hierarchy, their membership, and direct authority. And the division of labor is vertical and very rigid, and the members have very rigid bureaucratic roles. The second one is characterized by large corporate entities. Basically, these are impersonal economic units. And the key values here are self-interest, rational action, and independence. And basically, the motivational driver here is price mechanism, self-interest, economic interest, and formal authority, corporate authority. And the divisional labor is organic, based on your expertise. And what we propose, collaborative logic, conforms to neither the bureaucratic nor the market-oriented logic. Basically, it very much depends on a sense of shared purpose to engage, and possibly this shared purpose of engaging in and possibly changing and promoting social entrepreneurial activities. And this shared purpose is not directly given by management or superiors in a top-down fashion, but actually was chosen by the prospective members as they become members. And this opportunity that they can contribute and co-construct the community or further motivate the members. And the social innovation community seems to value interdependence, and it thrives on contribution from members that allow them more independence than typical work organizations. And division of labor rests not on hierarchical coordination or price mechanism, but more on spontaneous cooperation, aided by this thick knowledge of skills and resources held by other members. So you probably thought that this is not really a new phenomena, but the collaborative knowledge really fits the current technical, social, and economic circumstances better than the other two logics. And it's becoming more and more explicitly endorsed as a legitimate way of organizing economic and social activities, characterized by the more widespread use of such terms as co-working, co-creation. And it's been demonstrated, for example, in this open source, open software movement, which is very much characterized by collaborative logic. So what actually enables this logic is, as I already spoken, shared purposes, and also the dynamic sharing of tasks and knowledge through community networks and online tools, and active participation accelerated by internet architectures. So here, internet comes into a very big role. And we have borrowed from this typology of Web 1.0, Web 2.0, and Web 3.0 to characterize how internet architectures can affect social innovation communities. So through Web 1.0, community organizers and leaders basically can share documents with their members, kind of one-to-many broadcasting. And Web 2.0, through social networking, the members can interact online through social network platforms and exchange information to facilitate collaboration, basically one-to-many, one-to-one or many-to-many interactions. And also Web 3.0, that is the co-creation part. The members can utilize collaborative software platforms to create materials in a systematic, organized way beyond just knowledge sharing and networking. And this internet architecture is very important because, first of all, it dramatically decreased the opportunity costs of establishing new groups, which can be very costly in real life, face-to-face interaction. And secondly, it increased access to socially entrepreneurial activities through rendering resources. Resources are more available. Let me just turn to one example. That is the Maitian project in China, which literally means wheat field project. It started in 2005 in Shenzhen, and basically it's just one visual designer. He was a volunteer, went to the countryside and saw the poor students there, and he wanted to help them. So basically he put a petition on his own website, and then it was joined by his friends, and his friends spread the messages, and more people join. So in about 7-8 years, this has evolved from one person to 50,000 registered users on the website, and 5,000 active volunteers, which then are organized into 21 provincial boards and many more local boards. And they have, by the end of 2001, they have already provided 3.2 million RMB as student funding, and built 59 library rooms, donated 56,000 books, and spent 30 million RMB on teacher funding, disaster relief, healthcare, free dictionaries, free lunch, school innovation, etc. So what sets Maitian project apart from other NGOs in China is, first of all, it's entirely internet-based, centered around the message the BBS message board. Basically, the internet provides a very crucial space for otherwise unsanctioned and illegal associational activities, because they didn't really get a legal identity as a legal NGO until 2010. So before that, it's all kind of semi-legal, gray area kind of activities. The members have a very, very strong group identity. They call themselves 麦客, so wheat guest. And when they participate in group activity, they all wear the same orange shirt. But despite this strong group activity, they all remain anonymous. They use their online names. They never communicate with their real names, even offline when they meet each other. And participating online actually dramatically changed their social roles and behaviors. For example, you might be a manager, but on Maitian you are just a volunteer. Or you could be just a manual labor worker, but on Maitian you might be the manager. So it actually offers a very different social role for the members, and it very much focused on social internet-driven collaboration and innovation, which I'll talk in the next slide. And it has since grown out of single issue, just supporting students, into a multi-purpose social platform, supporting a variety of projects from MITN members and ex-MITN members. So if I can just summarize their activities online, Web 1.0, there's the MITN homepage, and they have Tianya and Kaili Wang official pages. They also have collaborations with news outlets online with many coverages. Web 2.0, they have this BBS board, which serves as a kind of central hub for the community, for sharing news and voting. They have the QQ groups for managing regional and national teams. So each local team have their own QQ groups. They use this YY web conferencing app to communicate with each other fastly. And they have official pages on Renren and Kaixin, kind of Facebook equivalent in China. They also have verified accounts, so their official account on Weibo, but also personal Weibo networks with same design of their avatars. And they all follow each other, creating a network. And they have a WeChat Weixin official account, which pushes news updates to subscribers. And finally, they have a Taobao charity store, which sells T-shirts, mugs, and etc. to raise money. And Web 3.0, basically, they have this crowdsourcing of proposals and solutions. So basically, members can propose new ideas of how to help children or others solving other social problems. And they would also resort to crowdfunding, asking members to raise funds. And co-production of publicity materials, basically, one example is they are celebrating their 8th anniversary this year, and they're putting together a music video. So the whole idea is people will come online and propose their songs, lyrics, and music. And then the members will vote on the songs. And then individual members can record their own songs, video recordings. And then they were all put together and mixed together as a single music video. So in conclusion, what we have tended to develop here is the concept of social innovation community and draft a flexible framework that can enable systematic comparative research into such communities, not just in China and Japan, but across the whole world. We argue that this collaborative logic, which contrasts with the logic of bureaucratic work communities and the market, characterize all social innovation communities. And they are now critically shaped and possibly accelerated by internet architectures. Of course, this account is just a very initial explorations, but it has taken us closer to understanding the basic coordinates of social innovation communities. And we hope that we'll carry on the research into different cases, and we very much welcome your suggestions on this research design. And thank you.
We're a little short on time, but I want, in Chinese we say 趁热打铁, okay? So strike the iron when it's hot. So any quick questions or suggestions, and we will let you respond, okay, at the end. Any question or? Yes.
I have a question that sort of speaks to sort of the entrepreneurial nature of its MITN, right? They're sort of relying on crowd funding.
Yes.
I was wondering how much of this is also targeted towards perhaps sustaining the practice as a form of business. I mean, I know the social sort of innovation and social entrepreneurship aspect of it in sort of essence also challenges the very purpose of making money with it. But I'm kind of curious, like, for example, Demo Hour is like a Chinese crowdfunding website that's similar to Kickstarter. It is very much so supporting supporting these grassroots kind of initiatives for people to make money off of social innovation projects. So I'm curious, for this particular collective, is there an interest in sort of sustaining this practice as a kind of economic activity as well?
So first of all, they would ask their members to contribute, first step. And then they will ask their members to find potential donors, either individuals or corporate. And since 2010, they've registered as a private foundation. So the money will actually go into this private foundation. And then the private foundation will kind of outsource the work back to the forum members.
Okay, yeah, that's also a question I have at the same time. But also, I think in your paper you mentioned Japan.
Yeah.
Okay, just now. So in what way can it also, or is it different? Or but please hold your answers. Okay, like we're running out of the time, or a little tight on time. Any other question or suggestion? Okay, I very much enjoyed your theoretical development, but there's I don't know how familiar you are with like Johann Benkler's work. Okay, I think there are lots of things in common. Okay, that you can build on. Okay. Okay, thank you. Yeah, but we can have more conversation. But I want to save enough time for Professor Patty Riley.
Yeah.
And I'm particularly honored, okay, to introduce Patty because I was under her wing. Probably also USC graduate students, right?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, so more. Okay. So Yasuhito Abe.
Yasu is not here, unfortunately.
Rong Wang.
Rong
Please
isn't
raise your
here,
hands.
but
Xing Wen.
Wan Shi is here, and Yan Bei Yan is here.
Okay, yeah. So this is another sign that Patty is taking care of graduate students. So without further ado, please.
Oh, well, thank you. And this is my opportunity to thank Jack and all the rest of the people who put this conference together. Having run these, I know how much work they are, and it's always important for everyone to remember to thank these folks as the conference ends. One of the things that I also want to do is thank my co-speakers. I enjoyed both of those presentations very much. As the mother of a teenage boy, I can tell you there are a lot of similarities. And Roger Silverstone was a very good friend, and so I much appreciated that. And I'm just finishing up Amanda Beacon's dissertation, I think her last chapter, which is on collective networks and collective logics in institutions. So I'll put the two of you together because I think that there's some very interesting comparisons. This is a big project. How much time do I have?
25 minutes.
Okay, Tom, you're going to let me know when I've done 10 and then 15 and 20. Thank you.
I can do it.
I just, want to make sure that we have time left over for people to ask questions. This project is coordinated by USC's Scenario Lab, which I direct. And so we've got other students on the lab who are not here who are involved, and other students who are involved in other aspects of this project. We're only going to talk about data from China, Japanese and English, and I'll tell you in a second why we're not using countries or regions because of the way the data came out in this. The Scenario Lab is a group of folks interested in how it is that people think about the future. And we work a lot with different kinds of organizations. We also do data collection that is based in government, not just like a commercial organization or an institution like a university, but large regional groups, networks. It can be just about any sort of grouping or any kind of organization that you can put together. The key thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to better understand how it is that people make decisions about the future. And so the concept is if we better understood how people make meanings around the notion of foresight. In other words, what is it that you think is the right thing to do as situations unfold and as we plan for the future, then we might have a better understanding of how it is that we make so many bad decisions in society. And so it's about sense making, it's about how it is that people look at really difficult and intractable problems like climate change. And so this is an example of a previous project that we did. We had a partner group called Cool California, and their idea was we need to tell better stories in order to get people to do the right things in terms of lowering their carbon footprint and voting for politicians who believe that climate change is an important and real problem. In some parts of the world, nobody denies that climate change is a real problem, but there are other places where that's not the case. And so the idea is you have to be able to imagine a future. You have to be able to make sense of something that's different from today in order to make good decisions today that enable you to create a better future for your children, grandchildren, society, the environment, the world. And so there have been a variety of ways that we've partnered with other organizations to get involved with this, and a lot of it has been internet-based. And so, for example, this was a partnership with the World Bank and the Center for the Future group up in Palo Alto, California. And they did something called Urgent Evoke, which is a crash course in changing the world. And we're the data analytics side of this. The Institute for the Future hired lots of great animators and people to create an online game that would create different possible futures. But it's very much about evoking different potential ways in which the world might change. So the project that we're going to be talking about today, we have a different partner, and this partner is the Jet Propulsion Laboratory part of NASA. And they came to us and said, we have a problem. We both understand that we live in a country, the United States, where there are a fair number of people who aren't sure that climate change or global warming or any of those things are real and or important. And so their conception of this problem is that people misunderstand science. That's the way they see it. They see it as a failure of scientists to properly tell their story. And so they wanted us to think about how people narrate the future. What kinds of stories do people tell about the future? And we said, well, we're already thinking about that, and we've already got some experience in climate change. And then they said, but we also, because NASA, has the unique capability of being able, to control the Hubble telescope and create pictures of the world from space. They want these stories to be more global. They want them to be about the world as a whole. And so they also were interested in what we knew or what anybody knows about how things like climate change affects the whole world and how the world together decides to do this. So besides the 3 languages that, are being investigated in this study, we also are collecting data in 15 other languages, and then next year, assuming that we've got the funding, there will be another, I think, 13 languages coming online. And so we've got lots of different issues, but it's appropriate that we're talking about this in the United Kingdom, because the 2 developed countries in the world that have the highest number of people who either aren't concerned about climate change, don't believe in climate change, or have no idea what it is and are completely apathetic about climate change, live in the United States and in England. So those are the 2 places where stories about the future of climate change are the most challenging. There's a lot of theoretical concerns in this study. I'm going to very, very briefly talk only about 2 of the big communication conceptions. One is what's known in the US as the Fisherian paradigm, which says that people reason through stories, that the stories have to have fidelity, probability, and coherence. So in other words, does the story make sense to people? Does it hang together? Does it have characters in it? Does it seem to be true? And clearly, given the polling data in the US and in England, for some people that's not the case. And so we're also adding on to this a lot of the work done by Carl Weick, who's an institutional scholar who looks at sense making and how it is that people take bits and pieces of the world around them and merges that with Powell and DiMaggio's institutional logics to try to understand what are the different conceptions of the world that people are concerned about. If you look at why we chose China and Japan and the US as sort of places to begin, it's because if you look at the impact of climate change and global warming, it's not just how many people you have, but how many resources do you have, what's your carbon footprint, and there's a whole part of this study that looks at, you know, different parts of the world, and obviously the US, because of the size of its economy, has a huge carbon footprint, also because of a lot of our practices. China, of course, has a growing carbon footprint. Japan has become more interested in these issues, not simply because of their carbon footprint, but also because of the way in which they create a lot of their energy and all of the issues around pollution, carbon footprint, global warming, and the issues around the nuclear disaster. And Yasuhito Abe, who could not be with us today, has been focusing a lot on the nuclear disaster and all of the different kinds of communication practices that have emerged around that. The background on climate change is also part of this study. Just really quickly, you know, there are a number of different discourses that are relevant to this study. One has to do with key global concerns around science discourse. There's an emerging movement in science called real science, and the real science discourse says that the social sciences and the humanists have created a problem for them, and that the discourse around the social construction of reality has allowed people to socially construct global warming as something that they can just deny. And that it's got a political dimension as well as a social dimension. There is another stream of research that's used media studies, press coverage of science around climate change, where the notion of being truly fair and balanced, you know, as opposed to the sort of Fox fair and balanced, is all about, you know, giving each voice, you know, some space in the media. And that having spent a lot of time going through the climate discussions, giving voice to the people who are unconcerned about global warming as something that's real, created, they believe, a sense of difficulty, at least in the US press. There's also, pardon?
10 minutes.
There's also a whole group of studies that indicate that climate discourse is challenging, that the science is difficult for a lot of people, the complexity of the information, the difficulty reconciling studies that come up with different conclusions, has real challenges when it's up against a discourse of economic survivability. And that when you're juxtaposing those two, you end up with a very polarizing kind of debate. And so this disagreement about the various meanings of climate change and the likely futures has created many different camps, which become, you know, quite obvious when you start doing studies on the internet. And so we've discovered, you know, just as kind of a, you know, a baseline, that on the internet, climate is talked about either as intensely material or peculiarly socially constructed. that there is, however, relatively little research about how you make these stories move into the future in any kind of coherent way, and that social media have become very important, both in pushing out information about this, as well as very important notions of social conversations around science, but not about climate change in particular. And so we've been looking at the framing of these stories and why those are largely unexplored. And at the end, I'll talk about another study really quickly. The method in this study ended up being more complicated than we had expected. That's simply because we chose China. We have feeds. We've got live feeds from GNIP coming in for English-speaking social media. We've got, this study's only looking at Twitter and Weibo, but we've got Facebook data. We've got lots of data. We've also got another part of this study that will be presented in August, where we're doing coding of legacy media, and I'll talk about that in a minute. This study uses lots of machine coding, and so that means that we train the machine on the code system, and then we allow it to do some of the big data analysis. We started out, just for example, in the English climate change data with 250,000 tweets, and that was just for the month of April. And so we had 3,300 on climate change in Japanese, and we boiled this down to separate past, present, and future stories, and ended up analyzing smaller numbers so that we could get a better sense of what was going on. However, because of the various problems that we were having getting the feed in Chinese, we ended up creating a whole separate system that's doing timed screenshots that then have to be human coded for duplication. We had bots that were trying to go through Weibo, and we had two, maybe three of those blocked. And we had a whole computer shut down as part of this project from one of my former PhD students, who's now at the University of Alabama, named Lu Tang. So we've had all kinds of interesting problems, and so now they have to be made searchable through OCR and all of that good stuff. So the coding schemes, we've got multiple coding schemes going on simultaneously, the past, the current, the future. We're also looking at these issues about the future. These are the story frames: simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. Are the primary ways in which Kurtz and Snowden have parsed stories of the future, and we've discovered that that works really well. We're working with Stu Schulman from Vision Critical. There's a whole process for managing all of this data where you have to first deduplicate because you have to get out all the zombie tweets. Then you have to cluster. Then we map them, and we're mapping them for a variety of ways that I don't have time to talk about, but anyone who's interested, I'll tell you later. And then we do sifting and coding processes. Just as an example of some of the metadata, capabilities, we can look by day, we can look by hour, we can follow, you can do event analyses like Earth Day, for example. All of a sudden, there's a lot of stuff about climate change. We were initially using some January data, but the air in Beijing was so bad that nobody talked about anything else. And then February, we had a different problem, and we dumped a lot of the February data because the pigs floating down the Hangpu River in Shanghai were completely overtook everything else. Bill, you apparently didn't hear that story, but in Los Angeles, this was like a really big deal, and so you can imagine what it was in Shanghai. And so we have lots of different kinds of issues. This looks like a Wordle, you know, where you just put a bunch of words in and it comes up in different areas. I'm not online right now, but in this system, what we can do is we can click on one of these. It'll tell you how many occurrences. It'll also move you to the sub-access architecture database. And I could go down and I could visually look at every tweet that has, that's been coded as future, which is cool and fun. And so just as, you know, really quickly, we also pulled off some of the pictures from all of these different tweets so that we could see what people were concerned about: fires, pollution, melting glaciers. But this one was a crack up. One of the most tweeted things in English was what climate change is going to do to our wine. And that like overtook everything else, which was fascinating. This is, you know, just sort of a more colorful way of looking at the coding scheme. Fully 54% of the tweets in English are less about any particular topic area than they are a push. They are knowledge, they are what we call directional. And so that means that it's a link. They want you to go read something, they want you to go to this event. It's a go-to sort of concept. The other thing, of course, that was really interesting was the second highest category is the past. And so in other words, in order to talk about the future, people are drawing on evidence for from the past, and so that's very interesting. We've got something else that we discovered was really, really interesting. As we started to look at this, you know, being American-centric as we are, we figured that most of the tweets would be coming from the US because it's just so big, and what we discovered is that around climate, most of the tweets in English are actually coming from the UK. And so you can just look up here, there are lots and lots of British-based organizations. In China, one of the things that we discovered is that it was a very different kind of data, much more rich stories, much more sophisticated linguistically. Climate change is almost always in China related to pollution, and nobody complained about the wine. The images, you know, are more about the air. They're about, you know, fruits that they think they're not going to, you know, have any longer, and things that are melting. But the other thing that was fascinating is, and I don't have time to go through all the data, but they were also way more positive. You know, it's like, we can do this, we can manage this, we'll make it happen.
5 minutes left.
And so I've just got a couple of other examples, and these will be posted on the Scenario Lab website, and so people can look at all of these things in detail. We also did the same sort of process for the Japanese data. We did the same process. The Japanese, by the way, were absolutely appalled at their own government not continuing with the Kyoto Agreement. And so that got a huge amount of focus, and then also back up to the nuclear reactors. And so they had some similar things. They had also impact on food, on cherries. They, not as high up, I think it was 7th or 8th instead of 2nd like it was in the US, was climate change impacts on the wine regions of the world. Number 1 and number 2 in Japan are fear of China, either Chinese leaders or the huge China environmental impact on the country. There's also a lot of retweeting, more in Japan around climate than in the US. I was at an earlier presentation today where they talked about, you know, lots of retweeting in the US, and in climate we discovered the US is actually low in retweeting, and so it's interesting to note that these are to some degree context-based. And so we've also got some comparisons. There's another very important thing that we discovered. The US is mostly a knowledge network. The Chinese is mostly a social network, and the English speakers are way more directional, and the Chinese and the Japanese are much more focused on very specific sorts of problems. And then we have bunches of other studies that will be coming out of this issue, geo-coordinating, repurposing retweets in lots of other countries. And we're also working with a Python algorithm that's going to allow us to look at the flows over time, because we'll be collecting this data, assuming that NASA continues to help for the next 3 years. So I want to thank all of you for being a good audience. No one fell asleep, and it's late in the day.
Thank you very much, Patty. Any question or comments or something to add from the co-authors?
I would add one thing. I've got a separate project that's looking at the Diaoyu Senkaku Island controversy. And one of the things we find in the Japanese, both legacy and social media discourse, is that the island's importance for resources is uniquely argued by Japan as an alternative to the nuclear power. And so an interesting strategy would be to reimagine an alternative future to argue that China can only environmentally clean up if they get access to higher grade natural gas, which is the greatest resource in that region. So it would be a strategy for imagining a future of shared agreement as opposed to conflict. And environmentally, it could pay dividend in both nations. Hokkaido, for instance, has terrible pollution that they explicitly blame on air coming from China.
Well, we had that. I could see that on my campus in Hong Kong. Yeah. Okay, yes, Bill.
Just, you know, long time ago, I did studies of the politics of modeling, and we're developing forecasting models of various economic scenarios. And trouble is, every political position in the debate would always have their model, you know, and therefore people could just feel like they could pick and choose. And the way that politically it worked best was when political decision makers got the actors around the table to talk about the assumptions in the model, so that they understood what the data were, what the strengths and weaknesses were, so that they worked on building the model in a sense together politically, in a sense of, okay, we trust this data, we don't. And I think the problem, when I look at a lot of the presentation of the climate stories, the public is asked to trust that there's no, you know, it's invisible, it's just magic, and it's, it's coming from scientists that don't tell us what. So it's like somehow there's got to be a way of involving the public more in building the model, not and the assumptions of the model, and are they reasonable?
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that NASA's reaching out. You know, they have obviously, you know, in a place like that where you do launches, et cetera, they're very interested in climate. And they've become very interested in climate change, and they have a lot of climate change focused scientists, but they don't understand how people respond to them. They don't understand how people could create an alternative story. You know, they wander in and they say things like, but we have data. You know, and there's this sense that they don't understand that you can't present data without a story around it. Otherwise, people can take those same data and create their own story. You know, that there's a lot of white space in data. And creating a story around that and understanding how people respond. So one of the reasons that using social media is profound for them is that this is people telling their story about it. You know, in this social media, you've got all these micro stories, and how do these stories aggregate, and how did those stories represent different social groups, different social movements, different political perspectives. And so they're using it as a way to understand what they don't get about the public.
I want to add here because very quickly, okay, this is the second time in a month that I encounter very interesting ways to apply the Fisherian paradigm, okay, the narrative storytelling paradigm, which I studied in the first year at USC. I had the privilege to actually study with, Aunt Waltz, Uncle Waltz, Fisher, and I think it's really interesting. There seems to be, I still don't know who wrote the, or yes, it was a blind review. I think it's going to be public, I hope. Okay. There's interesting to apply this, rhetorical theory into big data. That article was also about big data, okay, and then how the narrative pattern can make sense. Okay, we have to be very quick. Sorry, people are coming in. Yeah.
I mean, I was just really fascinated by your finding, Patty, about the English-speaking people use Twitter more as a call for action, and the Chinese people use it more to share their story or their feeling. And contrasting it with the previous paper where we saw Mighty-N, which seemed to be this website that was actually, all about action and doing something. And I was just wondering, maybe if the two of you might be able to explain why that difference might be, or have any ideas on it.
Well, what we're seeing, and this is preliminary because we haven't actually done a lot of the Facebook analysis, what we see in the US is that people put their story on Facebook and then they tweet it out.
Okay. Anything?
Well, I think
Mighty-N, yeah.
Well, Mighty-N is basically an issue-driven community, and so they also have this kind of they also have incentives, so you get badges and titles if you do more. So I think that's what drives people to do more acting out instead of just sharing information.
Okay, in light of time, I apologize. We don't have more time to interact here because people are coming, and Kim Hua standing there is wondering, what he missed. Okay, we traveled a significant distance. From, a small town in Yunnan to, Python algorithm. Okay, and it's been a great learning experience, okay? But when we talk about good case studies, oftentimes, no matter you're doing one case or multiple, there's the comparative, thinking is always essential. And China, internet, China is but just another case, in that sense. Okay, thank you.